In Japan, summer heat can turn fresh fish rotten in a matter of hours. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, the Japanese have preserved fish without a single ice cube or refrigerator. From whole salmon hung to cure in mountain farmhouses to blocks of tuna aged until they were harder than wood, the Japanese turned preservation into a craft, one built on salt, wind, smoke, mold, and time. These techniques, passed down through generations, still sit at the heart of Japanese cooking today in the sushi you eat and the dashi in nearly every bowl of soup. And many of them can still be done at home with tools you most likely already have in your kitchen. So how did they do it? I'm going to walk you through the ancient methods that fed a country across mountains, storms, and centuries of isolation. Secrets that outlasted shoguns, invented umami, and still shape the flavors on Japanese tables today. And it all begins in the snowbound villages of the north, where autumn salmon ran so thick that families had to find a way to keep them through winter. This is shiobiki zake, one of the oldest and most respected preservation methods in Japan, and it uses only two things: coarse salt and the cold winter air. When the salmon were pulled from the rivers in late autumn, they were gutted, rinsed clean, and packed inside wooden tubs between thick layers of sea salt, sometimes for a week and sometimes for closer to 2. The salt drew the moisture out of the flesh and left the fish firm, deep red, and safe from anything that might spoil it. Once the salting was finished, the fish were rinsed, tied by the tail with straw rope, and hung outdoors under the eaves of the house where the freezing wind off the mountains could reach them. For weeks, the cold air did its slow work, pulling away the last of the moisture while the flavor concentrated inside the flesh. The secret was the combination of salt and cold, because the salt handled the danger while the wind handled the drying, and together they turned a fish that would have rotted in a day into one that could hang in the kitchen until spring. In Murakami, the small castle town along the Sea of Japan where shiobiki zake is still made the traditional way, whole salmon can be seen hanging in rows from the ceilings of old wooden houses, their skins darkening to a deep amber as the weeks pass. To the families of the north, a well-made shiobiki zake was a source of pride, sliced thin at New Year and shared as a symbol of a household that had prepared well. Yet salt and wind were only one path, because in the warmer waters of the south, an entirely different craft was taking shape, one built on fire, sun, and the slow work of time. The making of Katsubushi is the longest and most demanding preservation method in the world, and to hold a finished block of it in your hand is to hold what is often called the hardest food in the world. It begins with skipjack tuna caught in the warm waters off the coast of Kagoshima and Shizuoka, and once the fish are landed, they are filleted into 4 long pieces and gently simmered in large vats until the flesh is just cooked through. After the simmering, the fillets are moved into a small cedar smokehouse and hung above smoldering oak or cherry wood for several hours a day over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. This slow smoking drives out the moisture while sealing the surface in a dark, resin-rich crust that protects the flesh underneath. Once the smoking is finished, the fillets are laid out in the sun to dry further, and then the truly remarkable step begins, because the surface is inoculated with a special mold called koji mold, which grows quietly across the fish and pulls out the last of the moisture while breaking down the fats into something clean and almost sweet. This cycle of sun drying and mold growth is repeated again and again for months, and in the finest examples it continues for more than a year, until the fillet is so dry that it rings like wood when tapped on a table. When the finished block is finally shaped into paper, thin flakes with a special wooden plane, those flakes become the base of dashi, the delicate broth that flavors nearly every bowl of soup, every simmered vegetable, and every sauce in Japanese cooking. Katsubushi is preservation raised to a craft that borders on devotion, and the whole cuisine of Japan quietly rests on it. Yet not every household had months or a smokehouse to spare, because the everyday kitchen still needed a way to keep the day's catch safe overnight, and for that the answer sat waiting in a simple wooden tub. The sound of brine sloshing in a cedar tub fills the kitchen, a slow mixture of salt and cold well water infused with a splash of sake and a strip of kombu. This is shiomizuzuke, the gentler cousin of dry salting, where preservation begins through immersion rather than dryness. In coastal Japan, where humidity often ruined food before it could be eaten, the method was practical and forgiving because salt carried by water could reach every corner of the fish without burning it. Fillets of sea bream or yellowtail were soaked in a brine seasoned with a little sack and sometimes a whisper of sugar, and over a day or two the liquid worked its way through every fiber, seasoning the flesh from within while stopping decay from taking hold. The chemistry behind it was simple. As the salt moved inward, the water moved outward, leaving the fish firm and fragrant while bacteria simply could not survive. When the fillets were hung to dry after brining, they kept for weeks, and when they were grilled, they came off the coals tender and glowing. In rural homes, brining tubs lined the walls of the kitchen like quiet guardians of the coming winter, holding the reassurance that even in scarcity, there would always be something to eat. And when the tubs were emptied and the fish drained, the next step often took the flesh out of the water entirely and hung it in the open air. Along the coast of Japan, the winter wind moves off the sea with a cold, clean edge. And it is here that himano, or wind-dried fish, has been made for more than 1,000 years. Split open and lightly brined, small fish like horse mackerel, sori, and atka mackerel were hung on bamboo racks at dawn and left to catch the sea breeze until they turned amber and firm. Each gust of wind pulled a little more moisture from the flesh, and each night the flavor deepened as the fats slowly concentrated near the surface. The process was silent but alive, with the air itself acting as the preservative. Himono began in the fishing villages of Izu and Odawara, where the sea breeze was cold and steady enough to dry fish without spoiling it, and the people there learned to read the weather the way farmers read the soil. It all came down to balance. If the air was too warm, the fish would spoil, and if it was too damp, the drying would never finish. After a day or two in the wind, the color darkened and the aroma ripened into something sweet and slightly smoky, even though no fire had ever touched it. Even now, a breakfast of grilled himono with rice and miso soup remains one of the most beloved meals in Japan, a taste that carries the memory of the sea breeze inside it. And when the wind was not enough, the sun took over the work. When the summer sun climbed over the rooftops and the shadows shortened, hoshizakana, or sun-dried fish, gave the catch a longer life. Across fishing villages from Kyushu to Hokkaido, small fish were split, salted, and laid out on woven mats where the sunlight could reach every side. This was preservation by heat and light, drawing out every drop of moisture until the flesh turned firm and glossy like polished wood. Sun drying was especially loved along the southern coast, where the warmth was steady and the air was dry enough to finish the work in a single afternoon. The secret was patience and clean weather, because a sudden rain could ruin an entire batch, and a humid day could leave the fish spoiled by evening. Families watched over the drying racks the way farmers watch over rice paddies, turning the fillets by hand and moving them into the shade when the sun grew too fierce. The result was fish that glowed amber in the light, chewy and rich, capable of lasting for weeks in a cool cupboard. It was more than a technique, it was a rhythm of daily life that tied the household to the weather and the season. But not every fish did well under the sun, because some flavors only came alive when the fish was moved into the shadows and met the slow curl of smoke. A thin curl of blue smoke drifts up through the beams of a mountain hut, carrying the scent of cherry wood and sakura bark. This is kunsei, the Japanese art of preservation through smoke, and it was practiced in the northern regions where winters were long and the fish had to last until spring. In villages across Hokkaido and Tohoku, salmon caught in the autumn rivers were salted first, then hung above smoldering embers of oak, cherry, or beech for hours and sometimes days. The smoke slowly dried the flesh while coating it in a fine layer of natural oils and resins that kept insects and decay away. The phenols in the wood acted like a soft armor, sealing the fish under an amber crust while deepening the flavor into something earthy and slightly sweet. Every region had its own preferred wood and its own rhythm of smoking, so a smoked salmon from Hokkaido tasted nothing like one from the mountain villages further south. For generations, these fish carried families through the snowbound months, and the taste of smoked salmon at New Year became a memory tied to home itself. Smoke did not only preserve food, it carried the scent of the hearth into every meal. And when the last ember cooled, another secret waited in the fragrant pulp left behind from brewing sake. The scent of fermented rice fills the storeroom, sweet and sharp at the same time. Keisuzuke, its preservation through sake lees, the soft, cloudy paste left behind after rice wine has been pressed, and it turned out to be one of the most refined tools the Japanese ever found for keeping fish. In the sake brewing towns of Niigata and Hiroshima, brewers realized that the leftover kasu was rich in alcohol and enzymes, and it could hold fish safely for weeks while flavoring it at the same time. Fillets of cod, salmon, or yellowtail were pressed into the sake lees and left to rest in cool storerooms, sometimes for a few days and sometimes for months. The alcohol slowly killed off bacteria, while the enzymes broke down the flesh into something tender and deeply aromatic. The whole method turned on the chemistry between grain and fish. Ethanol sterilizes while enzymes tenderize, and the result was a fillet perfumed with rice and ready to be grilled at a moment's notice. In old brewing towns, the practice became a mark of quiet luxury, a way of turning what was once waste into something that graced the tables of nobles and priests, and when the lees were scraped away, sweetness took its turn in the storeroom. Mirinzuk wraps the fish in a golden lacquer of sweet rice wine, and it is one of the most delicate preservation methods in the Japanese kitchen. Mirin is a syrupy cousin of sake, gentler in alcohol but far richer in sugar, and when fish was brushed with it and left to rest in cool air, the sugar formed a glossy skin that sealed in freshness. The method spread widely during the Edo period, when mirin became common in home kitchens across the country, and fishermen learned that a fillet coated in it could last for weeks longer than one left plain. The secret lay in the sugar itself, because sugar binds tightly to water molecules and leaves nothing behind for bacteria to feed on, while the alcohol in the mirin adds a second layer of protection. The result was fish with a caramel-colored skin that grilled up sweet and glossy, its flavor deepening the longer it aged. In old Edo, mirin cured sardines, and mackerel were sold at street stalls to travelers heading out along the highways because they kept for the whole journey. And where sugar sealed the surface, oil sealed everything. In a lamplit kitchen, a clay jar shines with clear oil, and beneath the surface, pieces of grilled fish sit hidden and untouched. This is a burazuk, the art of preservation by oil immersion, where the enemy of freshness, air itself, is simply shut out. Cooked fillets of sardine or mackerel were packed into jars and covered with sesame or perilla oil until every surface was sealed under liquid. Without oxygen, the fish could not spoil, and the oil slowly took on the flavor of the flesh while giving back its own nutty richness. In the cold months, the oil would firm up slightly, holding the pieces in place like amber. The method was quiet and elegant, favored in kitchens where refinement mattered, because a clean jar of oil-cured sardines could sit on a shelf for months and still taste as if it had just been made. Every spoonful drawn from within was a taste of patience, and every jar was a small treasury of flavor. But while oil sealed fish in stillness, another method let the fish come alive, deep in the dark heart of a rice barrel. Most ancient sushi in Japan does not sit on a plate of vinegared rice. It comes from a barrel that has been sealed for years. Nare-zushi is the true ancestor of sushi, and its most famous form is funazushi, the fermented carp of Lake Biwa in Shiga. Fresh carp are gutted, salted heavily for months, then packed between layers of cooked rice inside wooden barrels and weighted down with heavy stones. Over a year, sometimes 2 or 3, the rice ferments around the fish and produces lactic acid that slowly pickles the flesh from the outside in. The secret is that acid, because it drops the pH of the fish to a level where bacteria simply cannot survive, and what emerges is a fillet that is cheesy, sharp, and unlike any other fish in the world. To eat funazushi is to taste something that has been ripening since long before you sat down at the table. And in the villages around Lake Biwa, the barrels are still passed down from parent to child. This method is where sushi itself was born, long before anyone thought to eat the rice with it. And when fermentation was too slow, a quicker method waited by the fire. There is a hiss of steam rising from a shallow pot of boiling water as strips of bonito are lowered in for a few minutes at a time. Yudeboshi is the practice of parboiling fish before drying it. And it was the practical answer to the humid summers when raw fish could spoil before it had a chance to dry. By briefly cooking the surface, the fishermen killed off the bacteria that would have caused rot, and the boiled flesh dried far faster than raw meat ever could. This method was especially important along the coasts of Shikoku and Kyushu, where the humidity was punishing and every hour mattered. Once the bonito had been boiled and cooled, it was hung above racks in the shade to dry slowly. And this simple step of pre-cooking is where the road toward the world's hardest food began, because the bonito that was parboiled today would become the Katsubushi that flavored soup for generations. It was practical genius, a small act of fire that made every other step safer and cleaner. Yet not every fish went straight from the boil to the drying rack, because some were carried into a barrel of humble rice bran. A wooden barrel of pale rice bran sits in the corner of the kitchen, soft as flour and stirred every day by hand. This is nukazuke, the practice of packing fish and other foods inside a living bed of rice bran, and it has been part of Japanese households for centuries. The bran, called nuka, is the outer layer of brown rice that is removed during polishing, and it turned out to be one of the finest preservers ever discovered. Mixed with salt, water, and a few slices of kombu, the bran becomes a fermenting bed full of good bacteria that keep everything else at bay. Small fish and fillets pushed into the nuka bed absorbed its flavor while being safely held for weeks, and every household kept its own nuka bed alive, sometimes for generations. Some barrels in old family homes are said to be more than 100 years old, still fed and stirred every day. The brilliance of nukazuke was that a byproduct of milling rice became the guardian of the family's food supply. Waste turned into wisdom. And when the bran was brushed away, the next secret waited in the ground beneath the house. Buried in cool earth, sealed with heavy clay, and pressed under stones, tsubozume is the ancient practice of storing preserved fish inside earthenware jars. In old Japan, before there was glass or metal or ice, the earth itself became the pantry. Salted or cooked fish was packed tightly into jars, covered with a layer of oil or brine, and the mouth was sealed with a lid weighted down and sometimes pasted over with clay. The jars were then set into cool cellars or buried in the shaded ground behind the house, where the temperature stayed steady through summer and winter alike. Air could not enter, insects could not reach, and rot had nowhere to begin. Months later, when a jar was opened, the fish inside was still safe, and it had often taken on a mellow depth of flavor from its long rest. To the families who buried these jars, they were a kind of promise, a piece of the last good season kept safe for the lean months ahead. Yet not every household had cool earth to bury a jar in, and some turned instead to the ashes from their own hearth. In a dim mountain kitchen, fine gray wood ash covers the fish like a second skin. Haizuke is preservation through wood ash, a method born in the highland villages where salt was expensive, and every scrap of the hearth was put to use. After the fish was first salted, it was layered between handfuls of clean ash from the cooking fire and left to rest in a cool storeroom. The ash absorbed any remaining moisture, while its natural alkalinity discouraged the growth of bacteria and kept insects away. It was chemistry without science, worked out over generations of watching what kept the food safe and what did not. After a few weeks, the flesh firmed and darkened, and a faint smoky perfume rose from the surface even though no fire had touched the fish directly. The method thrived in the mountain villages of Nagano and Gifu, where winters were cruel and the sea was far away, so every bundle of ash-wrapped fish was a promise against the hunger of the cold months. It was humble and it was clever, and it turned the leftovers of the hearth into a guardian of the pantry. Honey and sweet amazake glaze also had their place in the story, and mitsuzuke shines like glass in the temple kitchens where it was often prepared. Long before refined sugar was common, honey and the sweet fermented rice drink called amazake were used to coat grilled fish in a golden layer that both sealed and flavored the flesh. The fillets were brushed while still warm from the coals, and as the syrup cooled, it formed a bright crust that kept air away from the meat below. Honey has almost no water in it and is slightly acidic, so it resists spoilage better than nearly any other natural food, and it passes that gift to whatever it touches. The fish beneath the glaze stayed supple and fragrant for a week or two, its flavor slowly deepening into something rich and slightly floral. Each piece glowed amber in the lamplight, sticky with sweetness and time. In temple kitchens and banquet halls, the glazed fish were treated almost as offerings, small gifts of care laid out for guests. Yet where sweetness lit up the plate, another method sank the fish into something dark and deep. The scent of soy sauce fills the storeroom, thick and umami rich, and beneath the surface of a stoneware crock the fish is slowly changing color. Shoyuzuke is soy sauce pickling, and it was an invention of the great soy brewing regions of Chiba and Wakayama, where soy sauce was cheaper and more plentiful than salt. Fillets of tuna, bonito, or mackerel were submerged in aged soy sauce, mixed with a little mirin and sometimes a splash of rice wine. And over the days and weeks that followed, the liquid darkened while the fish grew glossy and firm. The soy salt and the natural acids in the sauce worked together to hold off decay, while flavor pushed deep into every fiber of the flesh. Months later, when a piece was lifted from the crock, it emerged almost black on the surface and richly savory all the way through. To many households, shoyu-zuke was a small treasure jar open only for guests or festival days, and it carried the soul of Japanese cooking with it, balance and patience and depth. And while soy captured flavor and darkness, another preservative pressed the fish into an even richer bed. Miso-zuke wraps the fish in a bed of fermented soybean paste, and few methods have shaped Japanese cooking as deeply as this one. The most famous version comes from Kyoto, where the pale, sweet Saikyo miso has been used for centuries to cure fillets of silver cod, black cod, and yellowtail. The fish was patted dry, wrapped in cloth, and pressed into the soft miso where it rested for a day or two, or sometimes a week. The salt in the miso drew out moisture, while the enzymes of the fermented soybeans slowly broke down the flesh, tenderizing it and filling it with a savory sweetness that no other method could match. When grilled, a miso-cured fillet caramelized on the outside and stayed silky on the inside, and the aroma alone could fill a whole house. This method was favored by the shoguns and served in the finest tea kitchens of Kyoto, but it was also common enough that ordinary families kept a small tub of miso ready for whatever fish they had, and as spring gave way and the miso beds were scraped clean, the far north offered another kind of preservation, one written in ice. In the northern parts of Honshu and Hokkaido, the winter wind can freeze a fish solid within an hour of leaving the water, and the villagers there learned to use that cold as an ally. Kanzukuri is winter freeze, aging, a practice as old as the fishing villages themselves. Fish and shellfish were hung outside during the coldest nights of January and February, where the freezing air locked them stiff, and by day the weak winter sun softened them just enough for the enzymes inside to keep working. This cycle of freezing and thawing continued for weeks, slowly maturing the fish into something tender and quietly sweet. Yellowtail preserved this way became the famous kanburi of winter, prized in kitchens across the country. The cold did not just stop time, it deepened the flavor while it worked, because the enzymes inside the flesh kept breaking down proteins even at low temperatures. Farmers and fishermen alike learned to use the harshest weeks of the year as their finest kitchen, turning the season that killed everything else into the one that made the fish taste its best. Yet not every method needed the harshness of ice or fire, because one of the most refined ways of keeping fish in Japan asked for nothing more than a sheet of dried seaweed. Kombukimi is one of the most elegant preservation methods in Japan, and it uses only two ingredients, fresh fish and dried kelp. Fillets of sea bream, flounder, or halibut are pressed between two sheets of kombu and left to rest for a few hours or overnight, sometimes with a light weight on top. The kombu, which is bone dry, slowly draws moisture out of the fish, while at the same time passing its own glutamates into the flesh. This exchange happens quietly, without heat or salt, and the fillet that emerges is firmer, cleaner in flavor, and rich with the natural umami that no other method can match. Kombujime began in the fishing towns of Toyama and Ishikawa along the Sea of Japan, where the finest kelp from Hokkaido would arrive by boat and be pressed against the day's catch. The method was one of the earliest ways to make raw fish safe to keep for a day or two, and it also gave sushi chefs one of their most refined tools. Preservation and flavor became the same act, and no fire, salt, or barrel was needed. Yet the boldest secret of all was still hidden in the parts of the fish most people would have thrown away. Shiokara is the final and most fearless preservation method in the Japanese kitchen, and it turns the parts of the fish that no one else wanted into something intensely alive. The guts, roe, and small pieces of flesh from squid, bonito, and other fish are salted heavily and packed into jars, where the enzymes already inside the organ slowly break down the flesh from within. Over weeks and months, the mixture ferments in its own juices, producing a pungent, briny, deeply savory paste that has been served with sake for centuries. A close relative called uruka is made from the roe and guts of sweetfish, and is prized in the mountain villages around the great rivers of central Japan. The science is the same as everything else the Japanese perfected, because salt draws out water while the enzymes reshape the proteins into something the body reads as pure umami. Nothing was wasted, and every part of the fish found its way to eternity in one form or another. And as the last jar of shiokara is sealed on the shelf, one truth stands clear. For the Japanese, preservation was never only about saving food. It was about listening to salt, wind, mold, and time, and letting each of them do its quiet work. But if fish could be kept for years, what about the rice, the vegetables, and the sauces that fed the country between meals? In the next video, we will open the pantries of Japan and uncover 20 ancient Japanese foods that never spoil. Thanks a lot for watching. It was truly a pleasure to research this topic for you guys. And I want to hear your thoughts. Did you recognize any of these preservation techniques? And have you tried any of them before? Let me know, and I will see you in the comments.